What is it? Right here. And there's a sheet back there for you to color. And there's crayons if you want to. On that little round table right over there. Right over there. Little round table. Okay, everybody. Let's get together. Everybody get together. Try and love one another right now. That I have no idea. Do you? Come on, people now. Everybody get together. Try and love one. Smile on your brother. Okay. Too many empty chairs got invited today. And they all showed up. You know, that's the way it goes. Today we're going to be in Danny's favorite portion of Scripture, the Old Testament. And we're going to be in Deuteronomy. All right, Deuteronomy 22. Yeah, that was last week. This week, we're going to talk about, I have a very old book that was originally written in French, translated to English, called On the Composition of a Sermon. And he starts out by saying, you should never preach on obscure passages. And I think that's really good advice. But today we're going to take an obscure passage. And I'm looking for some input on this obscure passage as we go along today. So we're in Deuteronomy chapter 22. We're going to read verses 9, 10, and 11. And if you liked my teaser, you'll find out about no divers today, right? Thou shalt not sow in thy vineyard with diverse seeds. This is just old spelling for diverse. This is the passage where you find out God is against diversity. Only kidding. But he seems to be. I mean, when you shall not sow with diverse seeds in your field. Lest the fruit of thy seed which thou hast sown and the fruit of thy vineyard be defiled. Thou shalt not plow with an ox and an ass together. Thou shalt not wear a garment of diverse sorts, as of woolen and linen together. End of passage. The next thing goes on to say, thou shalt make thee fringes upon the four quarters of thy vesture, wherewith thou coverest thyself, which is a different thing than the thou shalt not section. And the thou shalt not section here is a little odd. Anybody can tell me exactly what this means doctrinally? I'm looking for it. You know, I've been searching. When I read this, by the way, and I guess let me take a step back and do a little intro here. We've been talking about this thing of God pitying us as a father pitieth his child. And we started out with that study that said, when we look at the law, there's clearly righteousness in the law. Clearly it's there. The law is holy and just and good. And it is possible, Paul tells us, sort of indirectly by personal testimony he tells us, it is possible that for a person as respecting the righteousness that is in the law to be blameless, and yet that would be worth garbage in the final estimation of things. And that the law was actually for us introductory righteousness. Like, remember the illustration we had, or that I had, was of learning to play music on an instrument, and how the very basic things that you would learn, this is the right way to do that. And you do it that way because it's the right way to do it. But then later on you find out there are many other ways to do it, and they're not wrong. They're very creative and important. But when we teach you in the beginning, we teach you a very simple thing, and we want you to do it one way and the right way. There's a right way to multiply. If you do it this way, if you line up all the digits this way, and you do your multiplication exactly this way, the answer will come out exactly right every single time. And it turns out there are many other ways to multiply. And the way we normally multiply isn't the simplest way to do it. There are simpler ways to do it that give you the right answer every single time. And this is an odd way to be, but this is the way we teach. This is exactly the way that if we pity one another, we would teach someone, right? If we pity our children, we teach them a way to do things. And oftentimes it involves very simple instructions like grab that block, pick it up there, put it in that basket. Simple things. Eventually they learn why we tell them to do it that way. And so we looked at all of those issues surrounding that. And we looked at tithing and how giving is beyond normal tithing, and tithing itself is very rarely taught as it actually is presented in the law. And there's a good reason why, because no self-respecting fundamentalist pastor is going to tell people, gather in 10% and spend it on anything your heart desires, like strong drink. I mean, what pastor is actually going to stand in the pulpit and say that? But there it is in the text. Deal with it. But we did learn something important from it. And one of the things we learned from it was that God was actually trying to teach us an even greater principle of how to give. And that giving should be a source of joy. And it should thrill us and teach us to fear the Lord by that kind of giving. And that cheerful giver thing wasn't just give until it hurts and then give a little more and it'll feel better. No, there actually is a joy in figuring out what to do with what God has put in your hand as a way of blessing someone else. There's a particular joy in doing that, and we should enter into that joy. Now we come here to this passage. And I'm asking the question, what in the world is he trying to teach us with these commands? When you look at the old, even the modern Jewish commentators on this, there's a lot written about this little thing of diverse seeds and mixed animals when you plow and diverse kinds of things in cloth. And it surprises me how much they could actually write about this, because when I'm reading it, I'm thinking, how much can you comment on this thing? Pages and pages of commentary on this simple principle, to the point where they actually have things that say, well, if you put on a garment and it's mixed cloth, and you find out later that it's mixed cloth, you have to pull it off over your head right away. And you're guilty of sin, one sin, for every amount of time you wore that cloth that it took you to pull it off. That's how you would divide it up and count the sins in wearing of that cloth. And I'm looking at this, and by the way, seeds in the field, isn't that a weird thing? First of all, what's a field? How big is a field? Is it 3 feet square? Can I count that as a field? And then I plant another one over here, another 3 foot square. But what counts as a field here? And why does God say this about seeds? Is there something about growing seeds together that defiles one seed with another? Anybody know? Anybody say yes? There might be. That a way that planting 2 different kinds of seeds together somehow defiles the seeds and makes them bad. The fruit is somehow defiled because the seeds grew together. Anybody say yes? Yeah? So give me an example. Anybody have an example? We have a microphone.
But now we have, thanks to putting seeds together, sometimes we have hybrid stuff.
We have hybrid stuff that we grow all the time.
That they're not, I mean, I don't see how that's defiled
not.
anything.
And in fact, we actually have a whole science around companion planting. And when you companion plant, there's actually an advantage to companion planting. In fact, there's 6 known advantages to companion planting. One is some plants are small and could use some protection from things like the sun and rain. And so you can grow those next to plants that have large leaves that overshadow them, and they grow in the shade really well. Companion planting actually can cause a smaller plant to thrive where it would otherwise have a hard time thriving in an open field. Second of all, it can be done for support. You can grow beans in the same field you grow corn, and pole beans will climb up the corn stalk, won't hurt the corn, and will thrive in the field where you grow corn at the same time that you grow the corn. Beneficial insects. Some plants have very small flowers and a harder time attracting bees. And if you plant those with plants that have large flowers, the large flowers will attract the bees, who will then find the smaller flowers and pollinate those as well. Symbiotic soil relationships can also be found in planting. For instance, beans, legumes put a lot of nitrogen into the soil. Then a nitrogen-hungry plant like tomatoes then take out of the soil, and the tomatoes grow better for having grown them with the beans. And there's no cross-pollinating, and there's no DNA destruction, and there's nothing damaging to the fruit by doing that. Now, I'm not arguing with God. I'm just pointing out that when we look at this practically, there just doesn't seem to be a practical reason for this command. Now, we often want to do that. We often want to look at the instructions God gives us and say, well, let's see now. Can I think through this and find a practical reason for this command? Turns out, it's hard to find. Another thing, by the way, is camouflage. It turns out, for instance, that if you grow tomatoes and potatoes, like one row of tomatoes and then a row of potatoes, that the potatoes will camouflage the tomatoes from the moth that plants its eggs that turn into the tomato worm. And that is because that moth finds the tomato plant by the infrared radiation it gives off at sundown. But the potatoes give off a wider range of infrared, and they give it off longer because they're a darker green leaf than the tomato leaf, and they give that off longer in the evening, and that is a natural protection against the tomato worm. And last of all, labor and soil savings. I learned this one as a kid. If you take your carrot seeds and radish seeds, put them in the same envelope, shake them up really well, and then just scratch open the soil and put the seeds down and cover them up, you get this interesting effect. The radishes space the carrots out exactly enough so that the carrot roots don't grow into each other. Furthermore, radishes are harvested before the carrots are harvested. And when you pull the radish out of the ground, you open the soil at exactly the time of the year when carrots need to get extra water in the soil. And then that soil closes up while the carrots need a little less water so that they don't rot in the ground. So planting your radishes and your carrots together turns out to be a really good idea in the same ground. And they don't hurt each other. There's no DNA crossover. There's no destruction. There's nothing corrupt in the fruit of those things itself. Yet he makes the statement, thou shalt not sow thy vineyard with diverse seeds, lest the fruit of thy seed which thou hast sown and the fruit of thy vineyard be defiled. I look at this next one the same way. Thou shalt not plow with an ox and an ass together. Do you know there's really nothing wrong with plowing with an ox and an ass together from a purely practical perspective? Just like the plants, oddly, an ox and an ass can plow together. They can get along with each other. An ass is a really interesting animal. It can get along with some other animals kind of weird. And they can also fight one another. But oddly, there isn't anything physically preventing it from happening. Maybe in the personality of one ox and one ass and some problems you're going to have with some of that stuff. But if you wanted to, probably pull this off. But God said don't do it, at least for the Israelites. And then this thing about garments of diverse sorts. We wear garments of diverse sorts all the time. We wear cotton polyester stuff all the time. Your linen sheets are probably sewn with cotton thread. Why would he do this? Furthermore, this not only constitutes by linen and wool, but leather as well. How many garments do you have that have a leather patch on them? Or leather patches on the sleeves, and you have leather in the garment. So what is this all about? In fact, looking at the Jewish commentators, some of them look at this passage and say, don't try to figure this out. And they say it for this reason. They say, this is a statute. You're supposed to obey it. You're not supposed to figure it out. You're just supposed to obey it. Now, for a minute, take a minute with me and try to spiritualize this passage for a minute. Because this is the standard approach. Let's spiritualize it just a little bit, shall we? What do we think it could mean if we sort of spiritualize it? Anybody got any ideas? Come on, we have microphones. And there's one sitting up here all by itself, idle. I can't believe that. Somebody must need a microphone somewhere. Red.
You have to announce the topic.
Yeah, because they unmute you back
There.
That's fine.
This is the red one that's on. The other red.
The other red.
Other red.
Wrong red. Hello.
Okay.
Should be on.
Okay.
Light red.
Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. So I find it interesting that in one of the Revelation churches, Jesus talks about people had not defiled their garments.
Yes.
And so when I think of that and read this, now I have to, do a word search. No, no,
Do a little word study. Defiled garment.
to find out what garments is talking about. And you find out things like the Lord is clothed in majesty. People are covered in anger. There's all these descriptive words that are used in terms of like fabric and things that cover your body. So to me, 11 is easy from a spiritualization perspective. Don't, when it speaks of like habits and activities and lifestyles, we shouldn't be hypocrites. We shouldn't like look one way and at the same time be perceived as wearing a different way.
Sure, exactly. I think it's a great interpretation. In fact, when you look at the put off the old man, put on the new man, right? Very garment-oriented, descriptive language, right? So don't wear both of them. Don't try wearing both of them at the same time. It doesn't work very well, right? It's not practical for you. Yes.
The other red? Oh,
The
it
other
is
red.
on. Okay. Well, I'm thinking too because he was trying, sometimes if it doesn't make sense, he clearly wanted them to be separate and for people to see that they were separate. They were his chosen people.
Yes.
And so sometimes I think it was for that, maybe only that.
Could be. So to Linda's point, it could be that like many things, just like the fringes in the garment that comes right underneath of it, could be one of those things that God established as an ordinance in Israel so that Israel would, in everything in their life, be different than everyone else in the world. Didn't need a practical explanation, didn't need a practical application, didn't need a spiritual one. It was just so that they were different. And I think that's, to me, I could really buy that. In fact, some of the Jewish commentators make that as an observation. To me, I could buy that if he hadn't said defile in the middle of there. That bugs me a little bit, right? Because the one about the fringes of your garment doesn't have anything about defilement in it. That makes sense, right? That's different. Go ahead. White.
It kind of reminds me of the parable of the tares, and I didn't know if that maybe ties in. I don't know.
Well, that's an interesting observation. In fact, what if Just go with me on this one for a minute. What if God was pitying them like a father pities his children? And he's giving them a little instruction here, just like you might give a child. Do it like this. You may not understand why I'm telling you to do it like this for a very long time. One day, you'll be able to understand why I told you to do it that way. I have an illustration of this that I got from a very old man. He was, I say that, very old now. 61. He was in his 80s at the time. For a man in his 80s, he was still very strong. I remember his name was Mr. Fisher. I remember when we were removing old Victorian 6-panel wooden doors from our house, and he wanted to use those panels for something. He stood out in front of our house, and he'd put the door on the corner, and he would just drive them down into the ground until they break, so he could pull those panels out. That's how strong he was. But his father was a cobbler, so he grew up in his father's shoe shop. And his father told him from the very first day he came into the shop, always hold this hook knife so the hook points away from you. Always hold the hook knife so the hook points away from you. One day, while he was cutting a sole out on the leather, he turned that hook knife so it pointed back toward him. And as he drew the knife, it slipped out of the leather and went across his belly, and he showed me the scar about 6 inches long, a nearly 70-year-old scar on his belly to this day, where he cut himself open with that knife. Now, Dad could have threatened him, could have told him all sorts of reasons. You could cut your thumb off, you could do this, he could have told him. But instead, he broke it down to a very simple instruction. Always point the hook away from your body. And if you just did that, you didn't need any of the other explanations. If you just did that, you would always be safe. What if this was one of those? What if God was giving them an instruction for something they weren't going to see today? They might not see tomorrow. It might not actually come for a very long time. What if he told them so plainly that, don't put too much thought to this. Just take it in and obey it. Don't try to overthink it. Just do it because one day you're going to need it. One day, I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to explain to you this thing about the seed. And if you obeyed this, you'd get the message when I gave it to you. So that Jesus can say, hearing, they might not hear. I gave it to them, but they're going to miss it anyway. So Jesus comes along, as someone pointed out, gives a very simple story. His very first one. Guess what it's about? A sower goes forth, sow. Go ahead. The blue, please.
Just to what you said, circumcision.
Just like that.
That was
What if it's like that? Only Jesus comes and actually gives this parable of the sower, and then he gives another parable about this kingdom and the seed and the fruit, and somebody sows another seed in it. And it's setting up this whole picture so that they could look at it and say, in the end, there's going to be a judgment. And it's going to have to separate out the seed. The wheat didn't get defiled by the tares. It's still the wheat. But there's an intrinsic problem with having the tares there that means you can't just go out and pick whatever seed you find and assume it's wheat. And you can't just go out and weed the whole thing because somebody sowed a mixed seed in that field. And these people who should have heard that message, and the moment they heard that message, it should have triggered in their mind, there's a sower, there's a seed. Is it me? Am I the seed? Am I in that? What am I? It should have pricked their ears, and it should have made them immediately think about this lesson that Jesus was giving. They should have seen it clearly. They should have been the first ones. And yet they don't get it. So that Jesus has to come and explain the symbol to them. And then his disciples begin to get it, but those who should have been most learned in the law still didn't see it. So what is this then about the ox and the ass? In fact, just so that you can see that how this might work, let's go over first of all to 1 Corinthians 9. 1 Corinthians 9. First Corinthians 9. And we'll go verses 7 through 14. We'll read 7 verses here. And I just want you to observe this statement he says. Who goeth a warfare at any time in his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard and eateth not the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth the flock and eateth not the milk of the flock? Say I these things as a man? Or saith not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, Thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care for oxen? Does God really care about the ox and the ass that you might yoke together? Does he really care about whether you companion plant in your fields or not? Let's read the next verse. Or saith he it altogether for our sakes? It's a good question. For our sakes, he says, no, for our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of his hope. And if you read down through verse 14, he actually makes personal application of that. He says, I've sown unto you spiritual things. Is it any great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it any great thing if we reap carnal things? If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we've not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers of the altar? Even so hath our Lord ordained. So let me see if I get this. The basic argument Paul is making here is that when God gave a command about oxen not being muzzled when they tread the corn, he was actually making a somewhat angular ordination about the ministers of the gospel. Because he really didn't say it for the oxen's sake. Does God care about oxen? Maybe, but that's not his point. The answer to the question isn't either yes or no. The question is, huh? That's the answer to the question. Like, huh? Does God care about oxen? He cares about you. And he didn't write it for the oxen's sake. He wrote it for your sake. And in so doing, he was ordaining that the ministers of the gospel should eat from the gospel. So at least we have this principle that says when we find these weird commands back there like this, we should look at them and ask that question. What is God? Because God's primary concern isn't the seeds I'm planting here. And it's not the ox and the ass. And it's not the garment and the way it's made. His primary concern isn't any of those things. He's writing this for our sake. Let's look at another one. Just so we can see the uniformity, if you will, of this principle, we'll just go over to chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We'll see a restatement of this. Verse 11. Now these things happened unto them for our, excuse me, our examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. What are those things that he's talking about? Verse 6, he says, these are our examples. What are those? That's the rock that followed the Jews around when they were out in that wandering in the desert. That rock was Christ. But God wasn't pleased with all of them, for they were overthrown in the wilderness, and that's an example for us. Right? To the intent that we should not lust after evil things, even as they also lusted after evil things. And then he says, neither be idolaters, as some of them were. And remember, some of them murmured against the Lord. They committed fornication, verse 8. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them tempted and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them for our example, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. One more, let's go over to Romans chapter 15, verse 1. Romans 15:1. We then that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak, and not to please ourselves. Let every one of us please his neighbor for his good to edification. For even Christ pleased not himself, as it is written, the reproaches of them that reproached thee fell on me. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope. So this is like 4 times in these 2 books, Paul has written this principle out for us. That said, all of those things that were written before were written so that we would be admonished by them. We would learn by them. We would get something from them that would be important in our lives. Therefore, when we read, thou shalt not sow with diverse seeds, it can't be simply an ordinance to be obeyed. It's written for another reason, for you and me. And therefore, when I look at these, I think, what is it that I'm supposed to get out of this? Well, when I looked at the ox, I got something about the ministers of the gospel. So it makes me wonder what it is that he might be saying by an ox and an ass. Like where else do we find that concept of yoking? Be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. It ought to be obvious, right? And I get that. I think it's funny, right? Which one of us is which, right? It ought to be funny. I get it. But look what he's saying here. Look at the picture he gave. Back then he was telling them, don't do this. And now he comes along and he picks up those very same symbols in the New Testament and tells us, don't be yoked together with unbelievers. You know, there is nothing wrong with companion planting in the natural world. But there's something wrong when the seed of the kingdom gets mixed with the seed of the world. There's something wrong when that happens. It causes all sorts of problems in our lives. There's something wrong when the seed falls among the place where there's weeds that choke it and keep it from bearing fruit. There's something wrong with that seed. And there might not be anything necessarily wrong with an axe and an ox when you yoke them, practically speaking, but there's something seriously wrong when we take our ministry and we yoke it to unbelievers, when we take ourselves as believers and when each one of us, by the way, just so you know, have a ministry. Every one of us are ministers one way or another. God has given you a gift, and you're supposed to be using it for him. So if we take that and we yoke it together with the world, then we have a problem. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with the old garment, or I'm sorry, the woolen garment and the and a linen garment, wool and linen being in the same garment. In fact, they don't pull, they don't stretch. It's not necessarily an inherently bad quality in the cloth. It doesn't necessarily produce that, but it does present a problem to us if we mix things that aren't supposed to be mixed on a spiritual level. The physical level was only supposed to be an example to us, so that spiritually we would learn a great truth. I was talking with Aaron a couple of weeks ago about math, and we were talking about calculus, which is a fantastic. See, Danny's like smiling. Yeah, this is a good conversation to have, right? We were talking about calculus, and she made this comment. She said, like, most of what we're doing in calculus is algebra. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's kind of like what calculus, the same way that multiplication is doing addition really, really fast over and over again, really, really fast, right? That's what it is. Division is doing subtraction over and over again, really, really fast. Well, calculus is doing algebra over and over and over again, really, really fast. So it doesn't surprise me that you have to do a lot of algebra in the calculus class, right? It's pretty cool. I mean, it's immensely interesting stuff. You might not think so, but right now, you're wearing eyeglasses that took some calculus. You're driving a car that took a lot of calculus. You're using a phone that took a lot of calculus. Trust me, this is immensely interesting stuff. But when we teach them very, very simple things that become very powerful when you really understand what it is. The first time you take the derivative of something, you follow a rule. And you just learn to follow that rule. And you're told, this is the rule, follow these rules in this order. But one day, you understand why that rule works the way it does. And when you understand why that rule works, suddenly it's a different kind of math for you. And you find all sorts of applications for it. I'm really sorry if you don't use algebra all the time. It means you had a bad math teacher. If you think I'm just not good at math, no, you just had a bad math teacher. Math is actually just a language, and you could have learned it. You could have been better at it than you are right now if you'd had a better teacher, just to relieve the burden off of you and put it where it really exists, right? Bad math teachers, lots of them out there. They know how to do things and then how to teach you how to do things, but they don't know why, and they don't know how to make it practical and interesting to you. Because when you really see what you can do with it, math becomes exciting. Look at this law. When you look at this, you think, what could this mean? How boring is it? I'm reading through this passage, and he says this, and it's like dry ground when I read through it the first time. I'm reading this thing, and it says, just don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this. And I'm looking at it saying, well, I don't plant seeds in a field. And if I plowed something in a field, I wouldn't use an ox, and I wouldn't use an ass, and I wouldn't use a yoke, and I wouldn't use a harness. And I'm not going to, so what does any of that mean to me? And by the way, I don't make my own clothes, so I don't get to figure out what's in them. And you're all wearing garments of mixed things right now. Every one of us are. Sorry about that. Nylon and polyester and cotton and who knows what all else is in most of the clothes we wear. They try to put a label on there. If they really listed out everything down to, you'd have brass and you'd have, every garment you have has metal in it now. It's just the truth. And so when you're reading through the passage in the beginning, you think this is dry. But if you looked at it from another perspective, you say, hey, wait a minute. Maybe there's something here that's important to me. Maybe I just need to understand why God said this. Maybe in the physical world, mixing seeds doesn't really defile either one of them. But there is a seed that Jesus mentions. And he tells the story of how it got mixed. And all the problems it created. The fruit became something you couldn't tell from the real from the fake because the seed got mixed. And what a shame that is. Look at Christian history. How much of our history has so much of not biblical truth mixed in with the biblical truth that people have a hard time telling the difference of really real Christianity from what seemed like paganism. Well, I wonder if that could be true of us today. I wonder if our, like, I don't want to go beyond here, but I wonder if it could be that we look like a Christianized version of the world. Could it be that way? We have our own radio stations. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I like to hear good, moving music. I like it that there's Christian music, but it's more than a little possible that we step over the line into this, like, problem with the fields. I've grown a lot of vegetables in my life. I've sown a lot of seeds by hand. Right? We didn't use a tractor. The tractor only plowed the field. And then we went along with our finger, and I had a little stick. Put it down, 3 grains of corn at the end of the stick, move it up, 3 grains of corn at the end of the stick. I got a coffee can full of corn seed that I'm crawling down this field on my knees planting. We were not a major operation. We were when I say small family farm, I mean small, right? We plowed an acre. Right? That's not even a farm. That's more, that grows more food in Michigan than a family of 8 can eat in a year. But that's what we did. And planting beans. And some seeds are big, and other seeds are little tiny things. And I hated planting some things. I really despised radishes and carrots. But I just want you to understand what he's saying. There's an importance to these seeds, and there's an importance to you. You look at yourself like you're 1 grain. You're just one in a bag of thousands. Like one little, do you understand how small a radish seed is? It's a little black speck. And if you have 100 pounds of radish seeds, you have about 1,000,000 radishes plants in that bag, or some odd number. I mean, it would be a huge number of radishes. So any one of those little radish seeds would look at itself and say, what difference do I make? Just one little seed. Yes, but the problem is, you get in the wrong spot. Let's look at it from the other side for a moment. What if it was, you got both, because you have both illustrations. In the parable of the tares, you have the illustration of all the good seed is in one place and somebody comes and adds bad seed to it. But in the parable of the sower, you have the illustration in the other direction. Good seed is sown where the weeds are going to be. And they rise up and crush it. What if that's you? What if you are that seed and you're meant to bear fruit and you're precious, but you become defiled because of where you go and where you grow? You say, okay, what about the ox? Yeah, but what if you were meant to do a work for God? Because surprise, you are. But what you did was weigh yourself down and hook yourself up with things that would never let you move somewhere, so that you could not do what God intended for you to accomplish. Think, well, that's not possible. God knows everything. I don't know. I know he knows everything, but that's not the question. Because Paul says, I frustrate not the grace of God. So it might be possible God's given you all the talent, all the equipment, everything you need to do a great ministry for him, to build something for the kingdom, to advance the gospel. But you don't. Because you hooked up with the wrong things. And what if it is that God has got for you a place to set out an amazing example of his grace in a life? But you mingle with things that tarnish and stain, so that when people see you, they never see the example that God meant them to see. What if this passage was like a child's lesson? Do it, you'll learn why later. Because that's the way we teach everything. And that's what he really wanted you to get out of it. I have one last observation. Jesus is pure and righteous. And when he comes down from heaven, he takes upon him a form like a man. In so doing, he doesn't mix his glory with humanity. He's not half glorious. He's not a mixed garment of half linen, half wool. He's not half glorious, half human. He is fully God, full holiness, unmingled with anything else, covered over with a garment of humanity, fully human, uncompromisingly human, not mixed with the glory that is God, but abiding in the same person, fully human and fully God. What if he wants you to be exactly like that? You are the new man. You are clothed in the righteousness of Jesus Christ, yet walking through this world in a body of clay, still appreciating what it is to be short-sighted and ignorant, having compassion on those that are ignorant and out of the way, just like God had on you, because Jesus Christ walked that way, we ought to as well. Never mixing the two, keeping them cleanly separated in our lives, knowing how to handle the things of this world like money and jobs and society, knowing fully how to do that, never compromising holiness in the process. That ought to be us as well. Thank you for being here this morning.